Hello, filmmakers. Welcome to a Black Magic Collective, the Working Director mashup. We are here with colorist Tashi Trieu, whose one of his most recent works was Avatar 2, The Way of the Water. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a little movie, which I'm sure was a lot of work. For those of you watching live, I want to let you know that we are taking your questions through the whole time. So if you put something in the comment box, we're going to answer that question, unless it's really dumb. No, I'm just kidding. We'll answer your questions even if they're dumb. Tashi, thank you for joining us for this. It's going to be a fun half hour of just really talking about what is the relationship between the director and the colorist, and really the DP, because we can't leave them out of this talk. How to best work with your colorist, and how to get the most bang for your buck, I guess, and save yourself some money. Tashi, let's start right at the top, though, for anybody who's a newer filmmaker who maybe hasn't had a chance to work with a colorist. What is it you do for films?
Well, thanks for having me. So a colorist can do a lot of different things for a lot of different films. But generally, we're the final creative finishing step in the process of making a film. Before distribution, we're the last ones who have a creative hand in sculpting the image, in preparing it for its final distribution and viewing ultimately on either a theatrical screen or on home video or any other sort of distribution models. So we're there to help the director and the cinematographer, the filmmakers, realize their creative vision as they had hoped to, all the way back from pre-production through production, and just really finesse everything together at the end. And that can manifest itself in something as simple as shot matching for continuity, so that it all feels like one polished professional movie where shots match to each other, or creating a unique look digitally that would have traditionally been done optically in camera, but now doing it in post, you have a lot more flexibility and creative nuance that you can apply, and it's non-destructive. So filmmakers can try out a lot of different looks, a lot of different ideas and styles, and really develop something with the broadest possible options, rather than committing to something in camera much earlier in the process.
Yes, that later makes you cry. I've never been there. I don't know what I'm talking about. So because this is such a because you're the last person really to touch this, one of the last people to touch this, and films begin potentially even years before someone is working with you, sitting with you. At what point do you think the filmmakers should be hiring you and talking to you?
Ideally, a colorist is involved in pre-production, usually at the stage where a cinematographer is doing camera tests, trying to figure out what the right camera and the right workflow and pipeline are for that particular project. And it's really easy to have a favorite camera that you're used to or that you're comfortable working with, but each project has its own unique requirements, whether they are optical requirements or lighting requirements or even mechanical considerations. And picking the right camera and knowing that you can get the image you want from that camera really does require going through all the steps of shooting something representative of your most challenging scenes in the film from a lighting or a camera perspective, and getting that through a colorist, realizing that image, seeing what works, what doesn't, kind of workshopping that, and then going into the production, fully prepared and knowing how to accomplish those goals. The colorist can be really instrumental in the look development process in pre-production, working with both production design, wardrobe, lighting, and the cinematographer on a common LUT for the project that can help translate their photography into their final vision, essentially building a custom film print stock for that particular film. Creating that recipe is something that a colorist can be really involved in, and then potentially even supervising through dailies. Big studio films often have a dailies colorist either on site or at the lab back in LA or New York, wherever is servicing the film. And they'll be working with the DP on a daily basis, but the supervising colorist might not be, or they might be doing the dailies and have a part in that. And being part of that conversation is really critical too. At the independent level, it's much more common to be brought in way, way later in the process. After everything's been shot, possibly everything's been edited, maybe visual effects have started or even finished already, and then the colorist is hired. So at that point, a lot of decisions have already been made ahead of time without your involvement, and it's up to you to kind of play catch up and figure out how best to roll with that and work within the circumstances you're presented with.
And deal with directors who are like, this isn't what I wanted at all. I love the idea of, I've never, in all the films I've done in over 20 years, I've never had a colorist at the beginning stages. And hearing you talk, it makes complete sense to work with you and the DP to create that. And I don't think I can not do that now. Now that you said it, I have to do that. I love that. Let's talk about the communication that happens, because I would assume there's a lot, especially in the indie world, where you're getting it way too late because maybe they can't afford to hire you for any prep work or whatever. What is the best way for the communication to happen between the director and you and the DP? How do you see the director obviously has the final say, the DP really has a push on the look. What, in your experience, is the best way for that relationship to kind of work the best?
Well, it's really going to depend on a per project basis, and the unique individuals involved. I've worked on projects where the DP is really forward because the director has less of an opinion, or is like kind of building their experience in visual language still. I've worked on projects where maybe the DP is not available; they're working on something else. The director is taking charge on that, or even projects where neither of them are still involved, and the producer's the one handling it, and they have fewer opinions about the look. They just want it to look good and for it to come out on time. There's a whole gamut to that, and I think it really boils down to both on the filmmaker side and the colorist side. You see these issues both in young and inexperienced colorists, as well as up and coming filmmakers, is just having a tendency to either lean into too much vagary, in their language and their discussion of things, leaving things too open to interpretation, or conversely being way too micromanagerial, and that's really problematic because then you're no longer able to creatively explore what you're working on, and having that sort of having a micromanagerial direction is not super productive, especially if someone's trying to discover what the film should look like, or trying to get to something that or trying to, if they're trying to figure out sort of the creative direction that they thought they wanted to go in originally, but maybe they can't achieve with that footage. That's always a challenge too, especially if you have budget constrained footage, where you have time of day challenges and you had dreams of it looking one way, but realistically it can only look another way. So there's always a back and forth there, and dealing with that in conversation, and having enough honesty between both participants is really important, and that's something that comes with confidence and experience. I see a lot of younger filmmakers making those mistakes, and the older, more experienced filmmakers, they know what they have, they know what a colorist can reasonably do, they know what they can expect of the colorist, of visual effects, of themselves, of their cinematographer, and where to kind of lean there.
If you're those of you watching, if you're in a group and you're asking us questions, give us permission to see your name, because Facebook user, which I don't know who this is, actually is asking you the next question I was going to ask you, basically, which is, if the budget's minuscule and you're not able to hire in pre-production stage, does a lookbook help the colors reach the goal of creating a certain look? I was going to ask, lookbooks, do you like when someone says, I want it to look like Stranger Things? Like, how do you prefer a director to get their feelings and mood across to you?
Yeah, I think lookbooks can be really helpful. A lot of the conversation that the director would have had with production design and wardrobe is really important there too. Understanding what sort of period we're going for, what sort of looks and feelings they want to evoke. That's important, because you could have a period piece, let's say something that's set in the 70s, and one filmmaker might say, I want this to be milked out. I want this to feel like you're viewing this through an old film print. I want this to look like what an aged 70s film print looks like to us today. Or someone could say, no, 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 I want this to look like we're in the 70s, and all the production design, all that stuff is fresh. The wardrobe is new, but it's the colors and the feeling and the palette of that day, but viewed as if we were there and it was contemporary. So having that sort of distinction helps a lot, because someone could just say, I want this to look like the 70s, and you could interpret that in very, very different ways, or any kind of period. And it's the difference between a swords and sorcery film looking incredibly aged and sepia tone, or looking like Game of Thrones, which is very modern and contemporary, but just with a more muted natural palette because of the pigments and the coloration that they would have for wardrobe and production design.
Thank you for that question. And it was Marlon. Marlon, thank you for asking a great question. Everybody, I'm getting to your questions, I promise. These are great questions. Keep them coming. I want to ask, because we're on the topic of just taking looks and just making decisions, because I'm about to do a movie with visual effects, like in a way I've never done, like a massive visual effects. Is there things I should be thinking about in pre-production for color?
The visual effects pipeline is really important. There are a lot of times I've seen independent films kind of rush into visual effects and not prepare the material in a way that is copacetic with all the visual effects artists and vendors working on it. And it's rare that you have a project where there's a single artist or a single vendor. So you want to maintain as much continuity as possible. And something that the big studio features rely on post facilities for is all of the visual effects plate deliverables and organization, and producing those different payloads for visual effects vendors around the world and kind of distributing those. And that means that there's a common source, so that all of the shots are being pulled in the right color space, that they're being pulled with the right image integrity, that the scaling is performed exactly the same way, and that when it all comes back from the visual effects vendors in the end, it will all line up perfectly with what the filmmakers have been seeing in their edit, and with the original footage as it would have been viewed through the DI or the dailies process. So that is something that I think a lot of independent filmmakers can emulate now that they have tools like DaVinci Resolve at their disposal. They have tools like Fusion within Resolve that give them a lot of professional tool sets for visual effects. Having those kind of tools means that they can produce visual effects plate pulls themselves, or working with a colorist, they can do that without having a big facility behind them, and still get that sort of professional organization and coordination. And you see that it's real easy for anyone with a 4K camera to produce a 4K movie now, if there are no visual effects in that film. But as soon as you have visual effects, it starts to increase in complexity rather quickly, and you get to a point where the indie mentality of it kind of collides with a studio mentality, and you have to bridge those in some way. And a lot of people fail in that process and end up with visual effects that are either going over budget because of constraints or issues that they're having to redo, or they're not able to get what they want out of it, or they have some sort of compromised image quality in it. And we don't want that. We want it to be as good as it can possibly be. So taking those more studio mindset, that studio pipeline mentality, and applying that to an indie film, I think is one of the best things that an indie filmmaker can do. Several years ago, I was running into an issue where a lot of indie films I was working on were having these kind of common problems. So I actually wrote a white paper and a guide for that, to help educate directors, mainly producers, and then editors who might encompass the entire post-production department on an indie film, on kind of how they can approach the studio level way of working with visual effects. And that's actually available as a free PDF on my website. It's DI.
I was going to say, I want to read that now.
Yeah.
Is your website just your name?
Yeah, it's divfx.tashitrue.com is where you would find that free PDF.
Okay,
and that was something that I just wrote for all the different filmmakers who I've worked with over the years who need that kind of guidance and are trying to emulate the studio workflow.
And you said DIYFX dash
No,
TashiTrue.com?
sorry, DI VFX, like digital
DIV.
intermediate VFX.
There we go. Okay. Got it. All right. That's in the chat for y'all. So you can find that. I want to do that too. So one last question on the VFX then is, I'm assuming you're getting, after the VFX are done, you're getting it at that point because you need to make it all sort of work.
Right.
Is there anything that you've had come across your desk where the coloring was just really hard or impossible because of the VFX? Like, are there warning signs, things that filmmakers should look out for?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be a common problem early, like maybe like 10 years ago or so, when people were just getting used to the red camera and how you can debayer the raw footage in multiple different color spaces in different encoding formats. And naive producers would say, "Hey, we're just going to send the raw red file to our visual effects artists. They're going to work off the raw file." And they might bring that raw file into After Effects and think, I'm working in the highest quality possible. And they do their comp, they do their work, and they give us back a render as, DPX or a ProRes or something like that. And we receive it finally at the end, and they've said, yeah, we're done. The visual effects have been approved. Everything's good. And they've baked in a LUT into that visual effects shot, and not knowing so, because they think they're working off the raw file, but they're debayering it as the DP had seen it on set. So they're applying an S curve. They're essentially applying a viewing transform in the debayer process, but they're thinking, I'm working with raw, so it must be the full quality. They don't understand necessarily that there are different encoding schemes and different ways of expressing that raw data, either artistically with an S curve meant for viewing, or as log or scene linear meant for compositing and color grading. So they've effectively crushed shadows, clipped highlights, and now the visual effects shot becomes the worst looking, most compromised shot in a scene. And we're struggling to make the rest of the scenes, camera negative, match that visual effects shot. That's something that I've seen happen on projects where a colorist or a DI facility wasn't involved at all until the way end, like after visual effects were finished. Then they're brought in, and we're kind of picking up the pieces, struggling to make do with it, because the only alternative at that point is to redo the visual effects shots with vendors who might have been finished with their shots for upwards of a year.
Does it make more sense to color and then have visual effects add over the color so they see what it's going to look like? Or do you still
It's
color
not
it last?
entirely possible to, especially if your visual effects shots or if your plates are primarily foreground action on green screen.
Yeah,
There's very little benefit
that's true.
of pre-timing a character on a green screen when the majority of the frame is going to be digitally produced as a CG set extension or something like that. Not a lot that we can do with that.
So moral of the
Depending
story
on
is get your colorist involved as soon as freaking possible.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And a good colorist who's mindful of like the dailies and visual effects pipeline also understands the importance of using something like ASC CDL, which can be produced out of Resolve and then integrated into a visual effects pipeline in something like Nuke or Fusion. That sort of pipeline is really important in informing, what the intended color correction might be, but in a non-destructive way. For example, if you shoot a scene of a car, or a scene outside on a road, and you shoot it maybe during dusk or daytime, and your intention is for this to be a lot darker at night, and you would grade that in your dailies, make that a lot darker. Giving that metadata off to the visual effects artist is going to inform them better when they start adding CGI elements into that shot. Something that might have specular reflections, or let's say they add a CGI car, they're going to know, oh, hey, it's a dark scene. The car's headlights should be on. It's not daytime, even though it was shot daytime. It's going to be graded a lot darker. They can then see a rough estimate live and interactive within their composite of that intended color correction without anything being baked in. So having that combination of a CDL and a show LUT being provided by a colorist or a DI facility is really, really critical in improved VFX continuity and reducing the amount of creative redos. We know that there are always going to be revisions on visual effects, either for creative direction or for technical fixes along the way. But what you don't want is to be spinning your wheels creatively and spending your visual effects budget because of a miscommunication.
For sure. So what would you say for the indie filmmaker who is trying to get the best color possible, but obviously has on limited budget? What can they do to make sure they get the best color affordably?
I think the first thing that I recommend to any indie client of mine is if they can offload any of the conform tasks to their editor and provide me with a preconformed, either a preconformed Resolve project or more likely a preconformed ProRes or DPX sequence with a simple EDL. That way, I'm not having to spend any time at all. I just ingest the files, build it out in my Resolve project, and I can start color. I'm not spending any of their money and their time on the conform aspect, and especially on documentaries. That's really, really important because you're dealing with such a mix of recreation footage or archival footage at different frame rates, different resizes, different aspect ratios. Trying to replicate that in an online conform for like a feature-length documentary could be weeks of work just in the online conform portion, just to get it to the same level that you already have it in your Avid or your Premiere edit. And if we're not compromising on visual quality in any way, I would rather take a conform straight out of Premiere or Avid and work on that in those cases. We can't really do that for most feature films. But if you're shooting on something like Alexa or Blackmagic and you have access to that log, camera raw or that original camera negative media, and the editor can assemble that and do that conform and hand that off to a colorist, you're spending all your color money on color rather than catching up with
Hmm.
editorial, which isn't really an added benefit at that point. So I try to, on the front end, shave as much of the conform time off as possible to maximize their budget. And then on the deliverable side, if I can give them a graded, P3 or Rec 709 textless render, that satisfies their needs, and then the editor can take that back into their platform and apply all of their text, their titles, subtitles, graphics, any of that sort of stuff. And then they can produce all their various different distributables. Maybe they have a festival distributable, maybe they have an H.264 for screeners. They can produce all those themselves. That's even less that they have to spend on me as a colorist, essentially acting as a online editor or DI facility or functionally doing their deliverables.
On that sort of note of deliverables and filming, Manuel asks, "Do you have a favorite codec, and why is it your favorite if you do?"
I think it really depends on what we're talking about. If it's camera recorded media, I prefer to work with whatever the camera's native RAW format is whenever possible, whether that's Red RAW, Blackmagic RAW, Arri RAW, or Sony XOCN RAW. Whenever possible, I like to work with that because I can change those debayer settings and I can change the color space settings if I need to, rather than being restricted to what was chosen in camera at the time. If I'm dealing with visual effects, we used to almost exclusively work in 10-bit DPX, but most of the industry's moved over to OpenEXR, which is great on a big visual effects film like Avatar, where I can have both the hero image, the final visual effects render, as well as multiple layers of DI mats available, so that I can say, I just want to color correct the characters, or I want to color correct the background, rather than me having to draw power windows, track those, roto or mask things out, or do elaborate color keys. I can just say, foreground characters, and then just a simple power window, and very, very quickly perform a correction. So EXR as a visual effects deliverable is a great codec and a great format. And then as far as rendering out, if we're going out for home video or broadcast, ProRes 444 is a really, really great, very robust codec. If you're delivering to major studios, we're going to be doing IMF JPEG 2000, which is incredibly high quality, much higher bit rate. Something that used to be unobtainable for a colorist working at home, for an owner operator, editor, or colorist to produce, but now is something you can produce for free out of Resolve. And Resolve is now one of the preferred platforms for producing IMFs for Netflix deliverable or Fox and Disney deliverables. A lot of those get produced out of Resolve.
There's a great question that came in from was it Rebecca at Haiti Pictures. As a director, how can I fine tune my color language when giving color notes? For example, how do I know when to say this needs more magenta or green?
I think that's going to be, up to you and your footage. Like, I think it's best for you to speak clearly when you have objections. If you see something that you don't like, make that clear up front. Don't hope that it will somehow sort itself out later. Being very clear about what you don't like and you do like will help guide a colorist so that that any of the further work they do on the film will be more within those parameters. I think that having a good color language, a good color vocabulary is useful, but everybody's different. There are going to be people who are a little bit more math and analytically based, and they're going to speak in your primaries and your secondary colors, and then percentages or values between those. Or you're going to have people who come from a more traditional art background and are going to have names for hundreds and hundreds of colors and have a really, really expansive color vocabulary. All of that's going to depend, and of course that's going to vary depending on your native language too. Different languages have different names for different colors, or might even have multiple names for certain shades of sky blue that we don't necessarily have in American English. So I think just making sure that you're speaking a common language with your colorist, and that you can describe those color changes in a way that works for both of you. That's good. I always hate when someone says, "Oh, let's just change this a skosh, but like not too much. Let's just like the smallest possible change." It's like, well, if it's the smallest possible change, we can't see the change. So what is a meaningful difference that matters in that context? That's kind of up to you guys to figure out. In the room, or if you're working remotely, in some sort of in-person fashion, rather than a like asynchronous process where you're reviewing a QuickTime and giving notes. It's going to be a lot easier to dial that in a live session.
And Rebecca, you asked how you could possibly educate yourself on the language. I do recommend to all of you watching and listening that Blackmagic Collective is right now, if you had the newsletter, you can sign up for the free classes, which means there's going to be a class on color. So you can actually get in there and put your hands on it. The class is maybe meant for you to be able to do some of your basic color that you might need on projects, but mostly I say same as editing. I think as filmmakers, you should learn all these tools so that you can better speak the tools and better understand how hard it is to do the things that someone like Tashi does, and what they go through. So I recommend that. And if you didn't get the newsletter, email us at info@blackmagiccollective.com and we'll figure that out for you.
I've got two book recommendations on that topic too. There's one, If It's Purple, Somebody's Gonna Die. That's a book all about the use of color throughout film history, and kind of boiling down different colors into their respective like metaphorical meanings, like as they've been used very commonly throughout film history. And then Into the Language Glass, which is a book all about linguistic relativity and how we describe how our ability to see colors is very informed by our language and our ability to describe those colors, and where that comes from, like in an anthropological context. I found that a really fascinating book about color discrimination and
You
color
really are a
theory.
color nerd, huh?
Yeah,
I love it.
it's what I do.
See, I'm the kind of person that's like, I obviously, I know enough, I've done enough, I kind of get it, but I know enough to know that I rather pay for my artists to do their artistic jobs. Like, I'll direct, you go do that. You know all the color things. You go learn all that. Uh, what else? I think we missed it. We had a question back here. Oh, okay. So Jayasri, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Is there a difference between the way you approach a documentary and a fictional film if the productions are independent and have a comparable budget?
Yeah, I think that documentaries usually lean a lot less towards heavy stylization. It depends whether it's primarily recreation or whether it's a lot of interviews and archival footage, and what the scope and feel of that is. Like a true crime documentary, for example, you can really lean into much more narrative language with it and create more dramatic looks through the recreation scenes. I did a true crime documentary a few years ago where we got to make it look really great and like have a lot of fun creating that look, because a vast majority of it was really, really beautifully shot recreations, and giving it that kind of like scary mood and like giving it that feel was a lot of fun. And that was something that we did a lot in color. And the DP was very involved in that. I very rarely meet DPs on documentaries because depending on the length of the documentary, there might be multiple DPs over multiple years in multiple countries. It's very rare that I work with a DP on a documentary, but in that particular one, we were able to do that.
I would assume too that because you would work with multiple DPs over possible years, your job even becomes more important. Not that it's not always important, but just the fact that you have to make all of that seem cohesive, the whole doc, no matter who shot it, when, where.
Of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
and with uncontrolled conditions, like, I mean, you're working with not like anytime you're working with non-scripted material, you really don't have the benefit of another take for lighting or another take for camera. It's whatever they were able to capture, and especially if it's archival footage that might be a mix of professional and amateur video. You're working with stuff that has been translated from maybe 16 millimeter film to an analog standard definition transfer, decades ago, then converted to some sort of MPEG-4 that was put on YouTube that has interlacing and compression artifacts all built in, and trying to make the best of that in the context of the documentary. That's sometimes your hands are tied and you can only make it look so good. Sometimes the footage can't look any better, but we try our best.
I love. Because we're reaching the end of our time, I just want to remind everybody that if you do have any burning questions, get them in now. I want to go back to one of our first questions we got from Remote House Post. What lessons and obstacles did you encounter during the grade for Avatar? And what I really like about this question for indie filmmakers, it kind of goes back to the VFX, but like, it's got to be tough to work with real people and green screens and digital people, and like, so
Mm.
how are you involved in that process, and how do you, I don't know, how, I guess, translate that into an indie film world, real world problems? Because Avatar, we
Yeah.
don't have money for Avatar problems. So.
Well, and I mean, so many of the Avatar problems are very self-inflicted. We're talking about a movie with 3,000 plus visual effects shots, all 3D, all at high frame rate, all at high resolution. There are a lot of things going on there that just aren't something that an independent filmmakers necessarily encounter. It was all shot on stages as well, so you're not dealing with uncontrolled lighting conditions as one might. So even all of all the shots of the guys on the boats out in the water, zero of that was shot in open water. That's all shot in controlled environments. So they're able to really dial that in. Russell Carpenter, the cinematographer, was able to dial in exactly how he wanted his lighting to be there, and then Weta is able to take that the next step in their CGI work. So I was spoiled because I really got a lot of material handed to me in a really great fashion. So at that point, we're not fixing anything. There's no triage there. One of the biggest challenge that I had on the film is that, unlike a lot of films where you might have one, maybe two theatrical deliverables, maybe you have your standard exhibition format, and then maybe if you're lucky, you have a Dolby Vision or an IMAX deliverable for a regular film. For this film, we had 11 simultaneous deliverables, which then got permuted out into about a little over 1,000 unique DCP variants for all the different territories, all the different languages all over the world. We had 11 different versions because we wanted to be able to present the best possible quality in every theater, whether you're an ultra high-end Dolby Cinema or IMAX, or if it is a small town digital cinema and you're running 3D at like a low light level. We still want you to have the best possible experience and think that the audience deserves that. So we produce, custom tailored versions for all these different light levels. And that's something that I had to be able to manage all concurrently, so that when we get to a certain point, we're running all 11 of these versions concurrently, and any change that gets made has to be creatively interpreted to those other versions. It becomes a real organizational and technical puzzle. And having a lot of experience on similar films, I came into that very prepared. So it wasn't daunting or overwhelming, but it was certainly the biggest challenge that I had on that film.
I get stressed over having to make one DCP for film festivals. I
Yeah.
can't even imagine. We are at the end of our time. So let's wrap up with really kind of closing the gap, I guess, with the working director colorist relationship. Um, is there any final thoughts on that you would love to impart to directors specifically on how they can get the best color and best work with their colorist and not drive you mad? Any final thoughts would be great.
I think it's important that directors understand that a colorist is not a miracle worker. I think that some colorists might like to perpetuate the idea that we're crafting the image and that we're responsible for the look and the feel of the movie. We're not. I mean, 95% of that happens before we touch it. That's the cinematographer, that's the production designer, wardrobe, hair, makeup, lighting. All of that has a lot to do with the final look of the image. We're just there to push it through and develop that into a film print. Essentially, we're there for the final finishing polish. So understanding what a colorist can and can't do is really important, especially if you're at the stage where you're working in visual effects. A director who's working with visual effects needs to be able to know, I can finish this with the colorist. Let's cut our losses here. Let's have our artists work on other shots rather than continuing to perfect this one. Or no, oh, the colors can't do that. They can't relight a scene. They can change the value, the intensity of it, but they're not relighting. They're not fundamentally relighting this. They're not going to change the reflection or the specularity of an object in the scene. Like that's not something that a colorist can do. We work with what we're given and can only do so much with that. So I think that that's something that an experienced director learns, and that young directors just need to be weary if they're banking too many things, thinking that the colorist is going to solve those problems. Perhaps there's nobody who can solve those problems, and it's a matter of expectation management, or it's a matter of knowing, well, no, we really do need to take the extra minute or two or the extra 15 on set, even if it's an overtime, to fix this lighting issue, because the colorist can't possibly fix that in post. And that's something a good cinematographer knows too, is they know, if it means guys getting up on a crane and flagging something off, and that's going to take 30 minutes in overtime, that's a lot more expensive than if the colorist needs an hour to do it. So knowing what is possible versus what is impossible or impractical to do with a colorist is really, really important in utilizing them correctly, and not setting expectations too high.
That's a great wrap up. And this has been fantastic. Thank you for joining us. For everybody who watch live, thank you. If you're listening to this in post, thank you. If you have questions that come up for you, put them in the chat and we will try to get you answers. And go check out Tashi's work, not only work, but that white paper he wrote on basically the VFX and all that, which was at divfx.tashitrue.com.
Mhm.
And I guess go out there, make some movie magic, and don't drive your colorist crazy.
Thank
See
you
you
very
guys
much.
next week, I believe, with something new. And we are out. Bye-bye, I guess, if I can find the button that we're supposed to push. And we'll just do this.